It is my pleasure to introduce the moderator of the next panel, Purba Chatterjee, who you got to know from the last panel, and then the three panelists of the panel titled Evolution of the Communist Party of China, the Thought of Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, and Xi Jinping.
I have the honor of introducing and moderating the next panel. I'm just going to frame the panel for our panelists to speak. At the time of the founding of the Communist Party of China, the world's most populous country was burdened by abject poverty, with rampant feudal and colonial oppression, widespread famine, and discontent among the people. In a short span of 100 years, China has emerged as the second largest economy of the world, well on its way to toppling the United States from its seat of power, with all-round moderate prosperity and great achievements in science and technology. This seemingly impossible transformation would not have materialized without the CPC, and in trying to understand it, we must look closely at the CPC's leadership and their identification with the masses of workers and peasants. Through the long march, over 6,000 miles of impossible terrain and encountering untold hardships, the CPC won the trust, admiration, and support of the rural peasants and tribal minorities as the party of liberation that would deliver the people from exploitation by feudal lords and their humiliation at the hands of foreign aggressors. The soldiers of the Long March had utmost respect for the peasants, paying fair prices for goods taken from the villages they passed, in spite of their desperate need for food and supplies. Emerging from a bloody civil war and having sustained heavy casualties, when the CPC finally established the People's Republic of China, the new Chinese state derived its power directly from the people, with most of its leadership having risen from the class of peasants and having been active participants in the struggle for freedom. The CPC has constantly adapted its founding principles of Marxism Leninism for the Chinese context. Its leadership has consolidated new ideologies to form the political basis of state power in a changing society and economy, always driven by a profound love for the working masses, their traditions, and their spiritual and material strivings. The cadre of the CPC serve at many different levels from the grassroots upwards before they rise through the ranks of the party to decision-making positions. Through this process, they acquire a deep understanding of the people and their struggles and the sacrifices required of them for building a successful socialist state. In the interest of seeking lessons from the historical achievements of the Communist Party of China in our common struggle for freedom and democracy, we take a closer look at the party's leadership and philosophy. The present panel, titled The Evolution of the Communist Party of China, the Thought of Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, and Xi Jinping, will delve deeper into the political theories of three of the party's greatest leaders since its founding and their contributions to building the new China. Our first panelist is Dr. Monteiro, a world-renowned Du Boisian scholar, a former member of the Communist Party of the United States of America, and the founder of the Saturday Free School. Dr. Monteiro will be speaking on the thought of Mao Zedong, and I now welcome him for his presentation.
Thank you very much. I'd like to just start by saying every political movement or political party has to be judged by how well it confronts and is able to surmount the problems of its people. It is no matter, it's not an academic matter. In other words, you do not judge a political party based upon 5 variables that someone imagined and concretized in a PhD dissertation, later to be written up in a book published by Harvard University Press. Parties are human creations. They exist in human circumstances, and they go to the people saying that they, the party, will be able to help the people solve the problems that the people face. So I say all that to say that a party is judged by how well it surmounts and deals with the problems of its people. I think by that measure, we would have to say that the Communist Party of China has been a great success. Perhaps no political party in history, certainly in modern history, has been as successful as the Communist Party of China. However, we also know that the Communist Party of China, over the 100 years of its existence, has kind of articulated its history in eras, in particular eras. And they define those eras by the leading thought of that period. The thought of Mao Zedong, the thought of Deng Xiaoping, and now the thought of Xi Jinping. That is a political culture that we in the United States know nothing of. And we would do well to learn from it rather than follow the elite of our country who only wish to obscure and demean and trivialize the history of the Communist Party of China. Now, the thought of Mao Zedong. First of all, let me say this. Having been a member of a Communist Party, that is the Communist Party of the United States, and having been a part of the international work of the Communist Party, and therefore traveling throughout the world, especially in Africa and Asia, but also to Cuba, I had the opportunity to get a sense of the ways that communist parties operate, the ways that national liberation movements operate, national liberation movements that themselves are coalitions of communist and non-communist revolutionaries, and to study, for example, the African independence movements, which for the most part were not communist and did not have communists in them. Having said that, the Communist Party of China is the most unique communist party, probably the most unique national liberation movement that has ever existed. Most communist parties base themselves upon what we call the Leninist concepts of the party. Such ideas as democratic centralism, that parties have regular congresses and arrive at decisions which the leadership is then responsible for carrying out. And congresses occur every 4 or 5 years. The leadership is held responsible, and the membership from the grassroots, the smallest level of the party, up to the highest leadership, are in a relationship, a democratic relationship, where the top is held accountable by the bottom. And believe me, if you think that ordinary people debate and argue and fuss and fight a lot, you should be a member of a communist party, where they really fuss and fight, and, you know, long-term marriage, how people argue all the time. Well, think about a long-term political relationship. So there is a robust democracy within communist parties, but China's robust democracy was more robust than most. And from its very beginning in 1921, the Communist Party of China was involved in interminable debates. The first debate was over the nature of the party and was kind of crystallized in the 1920s in Mao Zedong's declaration that all power comes out of the barrel of a gun. That is not a position or a theory that most communist parties would have adopted. Most communist parties, contrary to current propaganda, believed in what was called the peaceful path to social revolution. That the working class and peasantry would become more powerful, more ideologically and politically united, and would thus be in a position to peacefully, or more or less peacefully, overthrow the rule of the exploiting classes. No communist party in my study has ever made the claim that power comes out of the barrel of a gun. So almost at the beginning of the Communist Party of China, there is this fundamental distinction or difference. The other thing is, I don't know of another communist party that had linked to the party a people's army, as in the Red Army, or as was called in China, the Workers and Peasants Red Army. So Mao Zedong, when he became chairman of the party, was also chairman of the Military Commission. For most communists in the world, that is a very unusual situation. And for myself, even right now, I have difficulty understanding it. But it kind of goes together with the idea that power comes out of the barrel of a gun. Well, but then, here is what is so important, and here's the particularity or the uniqueness of the Chinese revolutionary process, which the Chinese communists would repeat over and over again, is that they were in a situation, first of all, where the Nationalist Party, or what was known as the Kuomintang, was trying to exterminate them and had wiped out thousands of them who were active in the cities, especially in Shanghai. They were then forced to go to the countryside where they set up, and here's something that is also very unique, Soviets. Now, the concept of a Soviet, or the word Soviet, is not a Chinese word, it's a Russian word. And Soviet means, if translated, means councils. In the Russian Revolution, after the overthrow of the Tsar, councils of workers were set up in the large cities. They were called Soviets and constituted what was known as dual power or separate power. But in China, Soviet power was not a council in a factory or in a district of a city. It would include a whole province. So much so that at the height of Soviet power, in China, tens of millions of people were under the government of the Soviets and the Communist Party. So here you had not just a council, but a government over large parts of provinces and rural areas. This is again very unique. Alongside that, because again, the Kuomintang, or the Nationalist Party under Chiang Kai-shek, wanted to, and these are the words of the Nationalist Party, wanted to exterminate them. That's a powerful word, to exterminate the Communist Party and Soviet power. So the need for an army. But then, once you have an army and a party and the army linked to the party, the question arises, what are the military tactics of the party? Here is where Mao arises. By 1935, in the midst of the Long March, itself a special and unique military strategy and tactic, never or unknown, I'll put it this way, to military science. A long march, a strategic retreat from the places where you had power. But even if you retreat, what is the military strategy to defend the retreat? And this is where Mao's concept of what we today call guerrilla warfare, I'm certain they called it people's warfare, emerges. A less powerful army with deep roots among the people can defend itself, and as was the case in China, ultimately defeat the stronger army. We take this as common knowledge today, given the Cuban Revolution, given the Vietnamese struggle, given Korea, given many of the armed struggles in Southern Africa, that the way to power of the people is through guerrilla or people's warfare. But it starts in China. And it was not widely accepted, if accepted at all, in the world communist movement. Or in China, for that matter. The Communist Party of China was divided between those who supported Mao's concept of people's war and those who supported the traditional idea of positional war. By 1935, Mao's position had become the dominant one. By 1945, at the 7th Congress of the Communist Party of China, it is institutionalized that the Party of China is led by the ideology of Marxism Leninism and Mao Zedong thought. Again, this is very unique. The communist parties throughout the world define themselves based upon the theory that led to the Russian Revolution. They called it Leninism. And therefore, communist parties, the ideology was what was known as Marxism Leninism. In China, it became known as Marxism Leninism. They put it several ways. One would say Marxism Leninism and Mao Zedong thought. The general theory of revolution is Marxism Leninism, and the specificity is Mao Zedong thought. But then it took on a different character, or different formulation, and was called Marxism Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. And now this new formulation, this new science, was viewed as a theory of world revolution. So in this respect, the theory of the Chinese Revolution, certainly by 1949, was being promoted as a theory of world revolution, and the Chinese Revolution was as valid in world revolutionary processes as the Russian Revolution. Just at that point, I do not think, well, let me put it this way, I think that that was perhaps valid. Although going back into the 60s and 70s, I would have not said that. I wouldn't have. But the two great revolutions of the 20th century are the Russian and Chinese Revolution. The Chinese Communist Party, as we discussed yesterday, had to find the unique Chinese essence. And so the unique Chinese essence was associated with the thought of Mao Zedong. Let me draw to a conclusion here. How do I say this? The thought of Mao Zedong was a great achievement ideologically for the Chinese revolutionaries. It took China from the backward country that it was to freedom and liberation, and the declaration of the People's Republic of China. We talked about that yesterday. This was an announcement of a new state form, that it was not imitating bourgeois democracy of the West, as maybe the followers of Sun Yat-sen may have thought or strived for after 1911. This was a new state defined as the democratic people's dictatorship. And as Mao Zedong said, all decisions and all issues would be based upon the people and the needs of the people. This kind of confuses me at times. This formulation of a people's democratic dictatorship. Now, you know, in places like the United States, if you say dictatorship, you're in deep water because, oh, you're not democratic. So for the West, how can you say a democratic dictatorship? For them, that's an oxymoron, but it's not. It reflects dialectical thinking that democracy and a people's dictatorship go hand in glove, if you think about it. Democracy, from the standpoint of Marxism and the thinking of the Chinese revolutionaries, democracy and the dictatorship of a bourgeoisie, of a capitalist class, is really the oxymoron. It is a fake democracy. It is not a people's democracy. So the Chinese communists say that a people's democratic dictatorship is a true democracy that is based upon the people. This will also be called, and as they would formulate it, the people's democratic dictatorship and the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now this is very complicated because theoretically and historically we would assume that the two don't go together. That a people's democratic dictatorship may be associated with the first stage of a liberation struggle, where the people take power and then the working class, under the banner of socialism, will establish the dictatorship of the proletariat. You know that makes a lot of sense. But the two state forms are both democratic, one representing the freedom movement and that stage of struggle, and the other representing the consolidation of the state as an instrument and mechanism of the building of socialism. All of this is associated with the thought of Mao Zedong. Finally, the period of the thought of Mao Zedong, including the first 5-year plan, 52 to 56, 5-year plan completed in 4, that's the point of it, and the Great Leap Forward, which was a failure, and there are many arguments about why it was a failure. The Great Leap Forward was a uniquely Maoist vision where he felt that the energy of the Chinese people was such that it could be mobilized and China could rapidly catch up with the industrial levels in the West, in particular England. That they would communize agriculture, that all peasants would be brought into communes, that they would no longer have private farms and so on, and that steel would be produced not only in big factories, but in communities. And this production of steel and a higher level of the production of food would create the conditions where China would move to socialism and advanced industrial production far quicker than was the case in the Soviet Union. Mao, in fact, argued that this slow, more methodical, more planned economic development would only lead to the formation of a new class that would consolidate itself as a class in the state, in the bureaucracy, that they would get for themselves privileges and wealth by their position in the state and in the party. And thus Mao's idea that the party and what he called the revisionists in the party had to be overturned, and thus the Cultural Revolution. I think I agree with the assessment, 1981 assessment of the Communist Party of China about Mao, that you couldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, that the Cultural Revolution initiated by Mao Zedong was a disaster. I don't know that they said it in their assessment, but they came close to losing power. And they would lose power not because of external intervention, but because of the fact that they would lose the people. They would lose the people because a civil war could only mean catastrophe and disaster and production of food and other things for the people. So they rejected the last part of Mao. And in so doing, they were very correct in saying that the entire leadership of the Communist Party bears responsibility, because it was not just Mao. Mao was the preeminent leader, the most respected leader, and most of the leadership of the Communist Party and its membership highly valued his thinking, his theories, and they did that because of past practices. Would Mao recognize China, Xi Jinping, or Deng Xiaoping? No. He would not recognize this China. This is not what he would call socialism. Would he oppose the policies that came after 1981? I think he would. Are there people in China that still hold to the vision and thinking of Mao Zedong? Yes, there are tens of millions of them, and many of them are members of the Communist Party. In this respect, the ideas of Mao Zedong and the vision of Mao Zedong lives on today. They would say, and I'll end here, that this slow, methodical buildup of material wealth and technological know-how that has brought China now almost 50 years after the death of Mao Zedong to the position that Mao had hoped for in the 1950s. Not only has China surpassed Britain and most European countries, or all European countries, but is now surpassing the most powerful capitalist country, the United States. But they did it not through Maoist methods. But Mao was I guess you could say, a utopian in the sense that he believed that you move to communism through a society that becomes increasingly egalitarian. He would oppose the wealth and income gap in China today. Deng Xiaoping and probably Xi Jinping would say, how else could we have done it? Mao would have opposed the use of Soviet philosophy and Soviet methods of what he would call economism, rather than the constant political and ideological development of the people and a wide democratic populist movement towards socialism and communism. I'll stop there, thank you.
And our next panelist is Jahanzaib Choudhry. He's a PhD student in history and a member of the Saturday Free School, and he'll be talking about the thought of Deng Xiaoping.
Hello everyone, as Purba said, I will attempt to give an introduction to a very complicated topic, the thought of Deng Xiaoping and its historical context. I want to start by turning our attention to a text which has guided my own thinking about Deng Xiaoping thought, and this is W.E.B. Du Bois's unpublished masterpiece, Russia and America, which the Free School had studied a few months ago. And the major argument in this work, among many, but a central argument, is that the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union and experience in building socialism in Russia was indeed a great experiment in social science, a great experiment in building a radically new human society. And I think this is all based on Du Bois's rejection of academic ways of thinking, particularly anti-communism and white supremacy. And I think if we are willing to follow Du Bois in rejecting this anti-communism, we can attempt to understand the Chinese Revolution and the leadership of the CPC in much the same way. With many successes as well as setbacks, the CPC's record is a great body of knowledge for the study of what Doc described people's democracy, a radically different way of governance. And as we continue exploring this theme, we can work towards an understanding of Deng Xiaoping thought, the period of Deng's leadership and the years after, as a great experiment in what can be called socialist modernization in a very complex country. And that is also to say that we can understand Deng and his thought as something that very much emerged from theory and practice of building socialism in China. And also think of Deng as a great Marxist theorist and theorist of socialism in his own right. And that is one of the central points I wanted to emphasize in this presentation, because I think that is where he's been very much misunderstood, especially by the Western left. But to begin with, Deng, the man himself, was truly a remarkable figure, like many of the Chinese leadership. And like many of the party's founding generation, he was born to a prosperous peasant family during the years of Sun Yat-sen's activities towards national reform in the year 1904. He grew up in a home deeply invested in education, and he did receive a classical Chinese education. But his family, like many of their class who could afford education, wanted their son to study in the West. And this was very significant in Deng's own development. He was actually given the opportunity to go to France. A group of Chinese businessmen had sponsored some scholarships for Chinese students to go to France, although it was just a partial scholarship that would cover travel, and the expectation was that once they went there, they would work and study at the same time. So Deng arrived in France right after World War I, and the situation there had dramatically changed for international students. There were very few job opportunities, and this made education very difficult for the Chinese students to afford. As immigrants, they were given very poor opportunities, and Deng ended up working in various factories and other odd jobs. He tried on and off to study at university, but ultimately gave up as he found it unsustainable. However, he and his peers in China, the other Chinese students, under the leadership of Zhou Enlai, actually founded a nascent communist organization inspired by the Soviet Union. And this would indeed connect with the Chinese Communist Party. So Deng worked for this in Paris for a time, and then eventually had the opportunity to go to the Soviet Union itself and study Marxism Leninism. So at an early age, he was both exposed to the kinds of modernity found in the West, namely in France, and also was given the opportunity to study Marxism Leninism and also see how the Soviet Union was attempting to industrialize. After some time spent studying in the Soviet Union, he was sent to China to work for the Communist Party of China. In this period, as we discussed, the party was very much focused on urban areas. And this is before Mao became the leader of the party. Deng himself was responsible for organizing an urban uprising. However, like most of the urban uprisings, this was a disaster, and Deng became very hesitant to follow the party line on this question. In the aftermath of the Kuomintang assault on the Communist Party, Deng was deeply impressed by Mao, because Mao was actually able to move his base into a rural area and started to develop this kind of rural strategy of people's war that Doc was mentioning. And he became a loyal member of Mao's faction in the struggle for leadership within the party. And for this, he faced his first punishment. He was purged for the first time because of his loyalty to Mao. And this was a very defining experience for him. In fact, in his personal life, his first wife actually left him over this because of her loyalty to the party leadership. And his children would later report that in this period, Deng had transformed from kind of a happy-go-lucky person to a very hardened revolutionary. He was eventually restored to an important position in the party as Mao's influence in the party grew, and was able to obtain, was given a very senior position after the 1935 conference in which Mao became the leader of the party. He went on to work side by side with Mao during the Long March, which was also a very formative experience in his life. And during the march, he was actually in charge of propaganda, including editing a newspaper called the Red Star. When printing materials had to be abandoned during the Long March, he was tasked with orally rallying the troops. During this time, he honed his skill in connecting with the party cadre and the masses on various levels. He made the 6,000-mile trek of the Long March, as he would later recall, half on horseback and half on foot, as he battled a severe case of typhoid that nearly led to his death. After the success of the Long March, he would go on to command troops in the Red Army against the Japanese and Kuomintang in many significant battles. And these are very large battles in the lead up to World War II and then during World War II itself, in fact. And during this time, he developed a very, very tough physical and mental discipline, as well as an ability to think quickly and experiment with new tactics on the battlefield. And so not only did he hone his ability to connect with the party cadre in the Long March, but also with his troops in these very difficult battles. And so from this experience, you can see that he was a person very much engaged with theory as well as practice. After the founding of the People's Republic, his closeness to Mao meant that he went on to serve in very senior roles in the party, including as General Secretary of the Communist Party under Mao's leadership as chairman in the 1950s and 1960s. However, as we had previously discussed, he was quite suspicious of the program of the Great Leap Forward and came under criticism from Mao for this. And he was also quite suspicious of the Cultural Revolution. Because of this, he was ultimately purged twice by Mao. First, in the 60s, he was removed from his portfolio as Secretary General, and first faced house arrest, and then was sent to a rural area to work actually as a machinist in a tractor factory. And he spent this time, again, studying, reflecting on Marxist theory, as well as the events that had transpired during the revolution and afterward, as well as renewing his connection in many ways with the grassroots, working as this kind of factory worker and being far away from leadership. Also during this period, although Mao maintained a respect for him because of his contributions, he did not allow Deng or his wife to be targeted by the Red Guards, and he always left open the possibility of Deng rejoining the leadership. He did feel the chaos of this period firsthand, not only being purged and working in a factory, but one of his sons actually was brutally attacked by the Red Guards, and in fact thrown off a three-story building, leaving him paraplegic for life. So he really felt this chaos firsthand. He was eventually restored to an important position after Mao's conflict with Lin Piao, and this was in the early 70s. He actually became ultimately the first person to represent the People's Republic of China on the floor of the United Nations in the early 70s, speaking in his role as an official responsible for economics and trade. However, again, towards the end of Mao's life, just about a year before his death, he was purged once again for being insufficiently loyal to the practice of the Cultural Revolution. So during this period, he was trying to both work as a loyal member of the party, and also because of his personal and political loyalty to Mao, but he was also trying to find ways of moderating the contradictions of the Cultural Revolution. And as I will cite the presentation Doc and Emily, where they discuss the Cultural Revolution, I won't go into detail about it, but essentially it's important to remember that this main point Mao raised, that class struggle within China and within the Communist Party, was the central thesis that Mao had during the Cultural Revolution. After Mao died in 1976, the Cultural Revolution did not actually end there. The party came under the leadership of what was known as the Gang of Four, led by Mao's last wife. And they were intent on continuing the Cultural Revolution. And they were actually quite hostile to Deng. Although Deng was still highly respected by the party cadre as well as large sections of the masses. During the rule of the Gang of Four and their conflict with the segment of the party leadership that was opposed to the Cultural Revolution, while Mao was still officially purged, there were large protests at Tiananmen Square and elsewhere around China calling for Deng's reinstatement. Ultimately, there was a great power struggle within the party that led to the defeat of the Gang of Four and the reinstatement of Deng. And the Gang of Four was subsequently tried and punished for treason and held responsible for the activities that occurred during the Cultural Revolution. After this, Deng and several others who had been opposed to the Cultural Revolution but had been part of the founding generation of the revolution came to power. But to consider the situation they inherited, economic growth in China had pretty much come to a standstill. There was a great deal of popular unrest, essentially a society at war with itself. And although there had been a rapprochement with the United States in Mao's last years, China still faced official diplomatic isolation, and also immense tensions on its borders with the Soviet Union as well as its other neighbors. If you put yourself in Deng's shoes in this moment, you can feel the kind of anxiety he must have felt. All the blood and tears of the past 5 decades of struggle to build a new China could have easily slipped away. Deng's study of the situation led him to believe that the great error of the Cultural Revolution was again to emphasize the continuity of class struggle under socialism and to ignore the need to build the productive forces of society. That is, to give people a higher standard of living, something that especially, of course, affected the working class and the peasantry. In 1978, about 2 years after Mao's death, he ultimately became the paramount leader of China and called for a program of a Chinese term which translates to a program of eliminating chaos and returning to normal. It's also, I think, interesting that he became the paramount leader at the age of 74, which is, I mean, in this country that's when you retire, but this is when he was beginning his tenure as leader of modern China. And so he really emphasized the end to the policy of class struggle and talked about socialist construction and modernization. He raised 2 basic points initially. The first point was a policy of reform and opening up of the economy and society. This meant basically opening up to trade and investment with other countries, but it was coupled with 4 cardinal principles. Upholding the socialist path, point 1. Principle number 2, upholding people's democratic dictatorship. Point number 3, upholding the leadership of the CPC. And point number 4, upholding Mao Zedong thought and Marxism Leninism. I think Doc's remarks might help you understand the significance of that. In other words, he was not talking about introducing a Western-style capitalism to China. I think it's clear quite early on he was talking about something very different. And I think it's also an important point that he had learned from what occurred in the Soviet Union after the death of Stalin, in which Khrushchev had actually, been extremely critical of Stalin to the point of rejecting many of Stalin's basic ideas. Here, Deng talked about upholding Mao Zedong thought, that is, upholding the revolutionary ideas that Mao proposed and upholding the role of the party. He realized that if he were to try to denounce Mao in the same manner Khrushchev denounced Stalin, this would lead to a severe crisis. And also, I mean, he still personally and politically felt that Mao had made a tremendous contribution. So this is very significant. And I think throughout his life, he did not think really in terms of individuals. He always thought in terms of the party and the nation. And so his program was quite unique in this way, something new. As we mentioned, the idea of people's war that Mao proposed is something that had never really been discussed in communist parties, and I think what Deng proposed was also something quite radical. Many observers at that time and to this day have misinterpreted his program as a restoration of capitalism in the Western model, but this is quite wrong. Although certainly it was very radical in Marxist theory, there were still some precedents. For example, during the time that Mao was in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, right after the Russian Civil War, the revolution, there was a period known as the New Economic Policy. Its acronym is NEP. And this was a time in which the Soviet Union actually allowed for a lot of market reforms and private enterprise, and even actually sought foreign investment. But this was interrupted by the kinds of economic sanctions and blockades put on the Soviet Union, as well as internal debates within the party. And although there were some thinkers that wanted to continue this policy into the 1930s, ultimately this idea was defeated by Stalin's proposal for collectivization of agriculture and also of industry. Similarly, even in Mao's own thought, in his program he proposed a new democracy, the program in which the Chinese Revolution was won, Mao talked about giving the national bourgeoisie bourgeoisie, or the patriotic bourgeoisie, who are loyal to the nation, a role in society, but limiting their political power, keeping political power in the hands of the Communist Party. Although Mao abandoned this policy, again, as due to the West's own isolation of China, diplomatically and economically, as well as the ultra-left policies which were adopted during the Cultural Revolution. Additionally, it's also interesting to note that the study of economics, political economy, and the philosophy of markets has actually been a topic of study in China since ancient times. Indeed, some of the European Enlightenment study of political economy was actually inspired by translating Chinese texts on that topic, something that's not actually widely known. So Deng and his colleagues, rather than importing this idea from the West of what came to be known as market socialism or socialism with Chinese characteristics, they were constructing an economic model based on creative understanding of Marxism and Chinese philosophy, constructed to meet the needs of the Chinese people in that particular moment. And this would really form the basis of what became known as Deng Xiaoping thought, which would be added to Mao Zedong thought as one of the leading principles of the CPC. Quite inefficient. He gave them the right to experiment with any technique that they would like to deal with the problems they were facing, particularly with food shortages and hunger due to very low crop yields. Many of the peasants, actually dissatisfied with the collective policy that had occurred in the Cultural Revolution, decided to divide up the collectives into small family plots. And this had the effect of bringing about increased crop yields and helped to deal with a lot of the discontent in the countryside. And although this model was then followed in many agricultural regions of China, and individuals were given rights to land, and in some cases, private companies were also given the right to use land. This was always on the basis of long-term leases, with the state maintaining permanent ownership of land. That's very important to remember. This was not what occurred in many third world countries in which wholesale land, agriculture, and even seeds were controlled by Western agricultural corporations. Similarly, in the urban areas, there were experiments in the form of special economic zones. Rather than mass privatization, as would happen in the socialist states of Eastern Europe, Deng allowed these special economic zones, beginning with the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone in Guangdong, the region neighboring Hong Kong. Deng had seen that many Chinese, especially during the Cultural Revolution, were willing to risk life and limb to cross into Hong Kong because they saw an opportunity for a better life there. What Deng did was experiment with allowing Chinese investors from Hong Kong, and then eventually Chinese investors from surrounding areas, particularly Southeast Asia, then eventually from other parts of East Asia, and then eventually the West, to develop industrial projects in this port area, and also improve the relationship between mainland China and Hong Kong. This did lead to a lot of successes in building factories and industrialization and employment, and this was replicated in certain zones in other regions of China, particularly in the West. However, it's important to remember that this was mostly focused on small and medium private enterprises in these special economic zones, and with some allowance for foreign direct investment. But at the same time, most large state enterprises were kept intact, and this policy was applied to different extents throughout China. At the same time, while there was an increase in foreign banking activity in China, the domestic banking sector remained highly regulated, with most large banks being totally under state control. The party's top leadership also would continue to set five-year plans guiding the economy at all levels. And Deng proposed that the model which emerged from these experiments could help China become a moderately prosperous society in the decades to come. And indeed now, Xi Jinping is speaking of having achieved this target of building a moderately prosperous society. And much of the economic data bears out it's been quite extremely successful, particularly in dealing with poverty and backwardness, because Deng had proposed that the contradiction now was no longer between classes of Chinese people, but between the people and backwardness, economic backwardness. However, in this whole story, the role of the United States cannot be ignored. This is where we get into some complexity and contradictions of Deng's leadership. It is certainly true that China had taken an increasingly anti-Soviet position under Mao and begun to cooperate with the United States, particularly after Richard Nixon's visit to China in 1972. However, the United States had still not normalized relations with China, still had not recognized the People's Republic government until under Deng's leadership in December 1978, the Carter administration officially recognized the government and normalized relations. The official communiques from this period stated that the United States and the People's Republic of China disagreed on pretty much everything in world affairs, except one thing, which was the threat of, quote, Soviet hegemony. Although there was no official treaty or alliance between the United States and China, this period has been termed by US officials as an ideological armistice. In other words, there was extensive cooperation between the two nations against what both perceived as a common Soviet threat. In this same period, Deng abandoned Mao's policies of exporting revolution, supporting armed struggles abroad, but he retained an important role for the military, particularly on China's borders. And this kind of anti-Sovietism actually led to some of the, I would say, lowest moments in the People's Republic's history, particularly the war against Vietnam, which Deng decided to engage in shortly after normalization with the United States in the name of teaching the Vietnamese a lesson and also sending a message to the Soviet Union. China's support for the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia was, of course, also tied with this. And so was, in the 1980s, Chinese support for the anti-Soviet forces in Afghanistan. And so these decisions, I think, played a major role in earning Deng the ire of progressive forces around the world. And I think one of the reasons that Deng Xiaoping thought has been kind of written off by large sections of the global left, although I would argue this is something that we need to reconsider in light of where China is today. At the same time, this cooperation with the United States was very much tied to reform and opening up. Of course, the U.S. would go on to make large investments in China. Also, the lessening of tensions in the Taiwan Straits was very beneficial to China. Although the U.S. did not end its own defense treaty with Taiwan or close any of its bases, which were aimed at China, this relaxation in tensions also meant that international shipping could come to China's western ports, again, where these special economic zones were. Additionally, this relaxation of Western policies towards China meant that China could increasingly trade and eventually become economically integrated to some extent with Taiwan itself, as well as what were known as the Asian tiger economies, particularly Japan and South Korea. And in many ways, this was a restoration of the trade and even cultural links that had been suspended by the Cold War. And this process has contributed a lot to the economic power in East Asia right now, which it's one of the major reasons why we could argue that East Asia is the center of the global economy today, because of the strength of the Chinese economy, but also because of the strength and technological advancement of these other economies that are very much connected with China. South Korea, Japan in particular, with some others like Singapore and so on. Although they maintain very different political systems and even some political hostilities. And so this was also the period known as globalization, and this certainly played a role in making China industrialized, what has become known as it becoming the workshop of the world. But it's important to remember that the Chinese experience with this globalization is a great contrast with how the rest of the third world experienced it. And that's another very significant lesson for Deng Xiaoping thought. Whereas this process of globalization, in which factories were set up all around the world and supply chains were spread out all around the world, this process, especially in the years since the end of the Cold War, has led to a massive exploitation of labor throughout the third world. the penetration of third world economies by finance capital, and the weakening of state sovereignty. The uniqueness of this Chinese model, market socialism, as well as the strategic decisions that Deng made, have led to China becoming the fastest growing economy in history. Hundreds of millions of Chinese have been lifted out of poverty by this unique model in a time in which neoliberalism has impoverished much of the global working class. Some of the credit for this must actually go to Mao, who, despite the mistakes of the Cultural Revolution, helped build a form of Chinese socialism in which there was a very healthy, educated labor force of an immense scale, which is in contrast to the labor forces that existed in much of the third world. And with Deng's decision to embrace the market socialism model, private enterprise and investment from around the world was able to benefit from this extremely productive labor force. And while some sections of Chinese society have certainly gotten richer than others, much of the working class has been able to improve their standard of living. And the surplus from all this activity was invested by into what Deng characterized as the four modernizations, which was agriculture, industry, national defense, science, and technology. All of this created not just a sovereign, but a very sophisticated and powerful Chinese state. And these policies will continue to be carried through even after Deng's death in 1996 by his successors. Indeed, one can make a good argument, as some have, that despite never earning a PhD in economics, it was Deng Xiaoping, whose schooling was in revolutionary Marxism and Chinese philosophy, who has been the modern world's most successful economist. And I would also say that perhaps the most important lesson for the left is the contrast between Deng's actions as leader of the CPC and Mikhail Gorbachev's as leader of the CP of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's reforms, so-called, not only opened up the economy of the Soviet Union, but also the political system to outside forces, transitioned the USSR from socialism to social democracy, and abandoned many of these basic principles, which Deng identified, particularly the principle of the democratic dictatorship of the people. This led to the ultimate collapse of the Soviet Union and its fragmentation. The divergence that occurred in the Soviet Union and Russia versus China in the 80s and 90s is very telling, with China lifting 600 million people out of poverty and engaging in great growth, whereas Russia actually experienced massive declines in life expectancy under Gorbachev and Yeltsin. Its economy contracted and basically became plundered in the name of free market reforms, a process that would not be stopped until the rise of Putin in the year 2000. And it's also significant that Putin's rise has led to a reversal of the hostilities in Russia-China relations. In fact, he signed the Russia-China Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Cooperation 2001 with Deng's successors. I know I'm taking up a lot of time, but I just will briefly mention that one of Deng's major challenges was the Tiananmen protests, and something for which has become very controversial, particularly in the West. And I will just briefly say that there has been a great deal of misinformation about what occurred in that period. Deng himself had really emphasized that the dangers of bourgeois liberalization. In a 1985 speech, he said, "Since the downfall of the Gang of Four, an ideological trend has appeared that we call bourgeois liberalization. Its exponents worship the democracy and freedom of the Western capitalist countries and reject socialism. This cannot be allowed. China must modernize. It must absolutely not liberalize or take the capitalist road as countries of the West have done." So again, it shows how clear he was about the difference between modernization and liberalization. And when these protests initially started in 1989, they were in response to the death of a prime minister who had been seen as a reformist, and because within the party there were some elements that did want to move towards liberalization. Deng initially allowed these protests, actually, and they went on for about 2 months, but he increasingly saw that there were rogue elements trying to take advantage of perhaps some genuine discontent with the convictions in China. Elements that wanted to, again, either bring back the chaos of the Cultural Revolution or destroy the destroy socialism and the leadership of the party. Although some in the party, such as the new premier, Zhao Jiang, actually wanted to give in to the protesters' demands and fully abdicate the party's role in favor of a liberal democratic setup, Deng stood firm. Actually, he was about, I think he was about 83 in 1989 when this started. So again, being in his shoes, I don't think he didn't want to give up a lifetime's worth of struggle and sacrifice because of the demands of some students who I probably weren't even born during the Cultural Revolution. So he initially took this decision to send in the People's Liberation Army. Initially he sent them in unarmed to try to convince people to leave. And many of the soldiers were actually killed by the protesters. The Western media actually showed pictures of the dead soldiers and told the world these were protesters massacred by the government. A lot of this is shrouded in disinformation, as I said. WikiLeaks cables, which have since come out, show that the Western embassies at the time did not believe there were any mass killings by the government. In fact, again, mostly it was PLA, People's Liberation Army soldiers that died. And since then, the correspondents who were there on the ground from the Washington Post and CBS News have actually admitted that the Western media manufactured a story of a massacre to defame the CPC. Again, this was at the same time that there were similar movements throughout Eastern Europe, and Poland, and East Germany, and within the Soviet Union itself, which actually succeeded in bringing down socialism and led to the kinds of financial recolonization of those regions by the West. So again, this was a very significant decision taken by Deng. And we know that since then, many of the protest leaders were actually evacuated from China by American and British intelligence, and some of them are still here giving interviews and talking about how horrible the People's Republic of China is. So I'll just move on to my conclusion. I just want to say that all of this analysis of Deng, his record, must be seen in the context of the rise of Asia that we're living through now, through the lens of Du Bois and his vision of a world beyond the domination of the West. And from Du Bois, we can see that the rise of Asia is a necessity. Whatever ways the West may have divided Asian countries in the past, the logic of history is that division should be overcome. And this rise and this unity must have many features: cultural, political, and of course, shift in moral values. Economics is certainly not everything in this rise, but it is a very important base on which a future can be built. And economic growth in these societies it does mark a great deal of progress towards undoing the underdevelopment of colonial relations. And again, Deng's great contribution is to produce this kind of growth, which has given a great deal of dignity and hope to the masses of China. And also to begin this process of China's integration with other major economies in Asia. In fact, bringing us to what may be considered an Asian century. So we must see Deng's successes and flaws. We must see that the CPC is not a perfect party, and nor was Deng a perfect man, nor is the Chinese nation a revolution without contradiction. Yet in commemorating their monumental achievements, we're not calling them perfect, but nor are we condemning them for their sins. We're pointing out the significance of this great democratic project, which, despite its shortcomings, has achieved something superior to what the United States has. This is to build a rising people's democracy, which has risen relatively peacefully, without military expansion, imperialism, or a policy of all-out war. Certainly, whatever sins China or Deng must have committed can never be equivocated with the racist, imperialist, and anti-people policies of the United States government. And it's clear to us now that Deng Xiaoping thought has guided the Chinese nation quite well since the death of Deng. And particularly in the last 20 years after his death, while his successors have carried on his ideas, while the US has waged a global war on terror, China has engaged in trade and constructive work within its own borders and throughout the Third World. While the US has spent trillions on wars of occupation, destruction, immense nuclear and conventional weapons buildup, and 800 military bases, Chinese leaders, guided by Deng Xiaoping thought, have spent their precious funds, the labor of their people, on peaceful construction in this new millennium. And this is something that is very significant. And so Deng Xiaoping thought this succeeded in providing stability, economic growth, and hope to the Chinese nation. From the crisis it found itself after the death of Mao in 1977 to the position it found itself in the year 2012 with the rise of Xi Jinping, which the next presentation we'll get into. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamal. Before we move on to the next panelist, let's take 5 minutes of a break and then we'll be back.
To frame my presentation also to follow the rules, but it seems like when Xi Jinping came to power in like 2012, like China was largely viewed as like not really a threat to the West. It seems kind of like inferior, basically that the West couldn't really China anymore. Right. And also there's like problems of corruption and all that stuff. And so, like, I guess how I'm trying to frame it is that like the party faced that kind of challenge of basically like the party becoming more subservient to the West and also losing touch with Japan, which is like where China is consolidated, like fought corruption and all that stuff. But I don't think that happened.
That's good. I mean, yeah, I mean, you also say like contradiction produced by Deng Xiaoping.
Great job.
That
Very
went on a
difficult
lot.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay.
What time is it?
Oh, it's almost 2.
The contradictions of that growth, like the fact that there was poverty, but also inequality, which affects the party. Also, I actually like this phrase, ideological armistice. Well, I think I heard it from Jimmy Carter, when he talked about like it started to end with Tiananmen, but also the fall of the socialist countries in Eastern Europe. And there was a feeling that like Tiananmen was just like the first thing, like there would be many more Tiananmen, and eventually like the party would and it's also because there were people like within the party who wanted to go towards liberal democracy, that vision would eventually just come in.
That was what like Clinton said.
Yeah, exactly. Right, and so they thought bringing them into the World Trade Organization. So yeah, but I think you're right about that, like tackling corruption, tackling also Western high intellectual, ideological culture, and reasserting the Chinese nation power. How long is that going? I don't know what time it started. I should watch it. How long is yours?
Last time I read it, was like 17.
Oh, good. Yeah, we can't gloss over that.
No, you can't gloss over that. You can't gloss over that. I mean, we could get into the war with India
Well, that's the thing about, obviously there's Mao's anti-Sovietism, but Deng's reforms didn't really change. Like, that's the thing. He reformed stuff in the Cultural Revolution, domestic foreign policy. And I don't know if they ever have taken it into account in history.
Well, if they have, they don't talk publicly about it, you know, and I don't see much of something like that. It's still a lot of history we don't know because it's buried in archives and other places.
I had some stuff to do. Because it's a lot going on. I told you about the Bible. It's like a shot, he had a stroke. So we had folks in there to get on his legs. He get ready to leave his hand. And then my aunt, she had a 5-line boxing up there, something like my husband. This was in 2017, and she took over the shots too. And now she had pain, headaches. See, some people it hit, some people don't. You know what I mean? So this thing is messy. I can't say that I'm gonna take it. I'm not, I'm looking at the conventional way with antibiotics. I do vitamin C, I do B's, I do zinc, and keep my immune up.
So you have the Red Army.
Yeah, I have that.
I want to know.
They be dropping.
Well, not the not by the
Or the Tiananmen.
Not at all.
Yeah, I mean,
I think that's like the
yeah. Well, this biography gets into it. That one, the biography of Deng. I mean, that guy is a Harvard scholar. He says that they matched that like 800 civilians died, but he says that also they had started to kill the PLA soldiers. Deng's own speeches, he says like the people who were martyred, the PLA soldiers were martyred, pay tribute to them. And then the WikiLeaks stuff is pretty good because it's directly from the embassies. And then these two journalists wrote accounts. One was with the Washington Post and one was with CBS. I can send you some of this stuff.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I feel like I've had a couple conversations with some of my friends from China. One of them just is like, I don't want to have anything to do with China. I just want to get rid of all my assets in China and come to the US. And I'm like, okay. But they always bring up Tiananmen Square. And they say, oh, this is why we don't like China. And I hold my tongue to say, like, well, what about the United States?
Right,
the United States has done, it's never stopped.
So we're going to start in a minute. Everybody
sit
take their seats.
Whatever you come up
Yeah,
with.
definitely.
Trying to do something.
I'm a holler at you. I'm a holler at you.
Everybody, if you could please take your seats, we'll start in the next minute for our last panelist.
Say no, if you don't take their seats, no lunch.
Should I just use your Please take your seats. We are starting now. Okay, so our last panelist is Jeremiah Kim. He's one of the young members of the Saturday School, and he's going to talk about the thought of Xi Jinping.
Thank you. I'm going to try my presentation today to build on what the previous two panelists have said in terms of the evolution of the CPC, and also what the first panel today presented in terms of China's role in the world today and how it's really part of this transformation of humanity. Perhaps more so than any other figure alive today, the leadership of President Xi Jinping in the People's Republic of China reflects the shape of a new epoch that is struggling to be born across the world. That is, a common future defined by peace, friendship and cooperation between nations, and the freeing of the oppressed from the shackles of poverty and war. Yet it is fair to say that most Americans do not view Xi Jinping this way. Mainstream media has cast Xi, along with Russia's Vladimir Putin, as a brutal, power-hungry dictator and an enemy of everything that Americans hold dear. President Joe Biden is fond of saying that Xi Jinping doesn't have a democratic bone in his body, and has declared more broadly that the great conflict of the 21st century is the battle between democracy versus autocracy, with the United States representing democracy and China assigned a label of autocracy. As the organizers of this conference have stated, we in the Free School reject this formulation. We believe that the true dividing line of the 21st century is between humanity and war. Nevertheless, the question still remains. What kind of society is China building today? What form of governance has it chosen? What role does China seek to play in the world? And is China, under the leadership of Xi Jinping and the Communist Party of China, truly an oppressive authoritarian regime? Or is China in fact developing a new type of democracy, one that marks a new chapter for humanity as a whole? To address these questions, I'd like to begin by talking about Xi Jinping's vision of the Chinese dream, an economic, political, cultural, and spiritual rejuvenation of China's 1.4 billion people that advances their 5,000-year-long history and contributes to the overall progress of humanity. This dream gives vibrant color and meaning to China's past century of revolutionary struggle and steady development towards its long-term goals of socialism and the continued improvement of the livelihood of the masses of people. It is appropriate, then, that when he articulates the Chinese dream, Xi Jinping consistently draws upon the moral wisdom and rich traditions of Chinese civilization. These traditions and values serve as a common touchstone for China's younger generations to embrace their role in pushing China toward a bright future. Such forward-looking optimism and confidence stands in stark contrast to the pessimism, nihilism, and confusion afflicting young people across the Western world. How does China seek to make its vision a reality? It would be impossible for China to achieve its goals if its 1.4 billion people do not believe in the ability of their leaders to govern responsibly and intelligently. A recent study by Harvard University found that the proportion of Chinese citizens who are satisfied with their central government steadily increased from 86% in 2003 to 93% in 2016. Another study by Canada's York University in 2020 found that 98% of the Chinese people trust in their government. In the Free School, we've often discussed the crisis of legitimacy in America, in which the masses of people have lost faith in their ruling institutions. Our own domestic disillusionment, however, should not prevent us from recognizing the fact that China's own unique system of governance between the party, the state, and the people enjoys widespread support. This naturally raises the question, what have Xi Jinping and the CPC's 95 million members done to win the trust of the Chinese people? It is important to note that Xi Jinping is not an isolated individual. As the first Chinese leader born after the founding of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping represents the children of China's revolutionary generation. And moreover, as a product of the training, discipline, and scrutiny undergone by every party cadre, Xi is also a testament to the health of the CPC as a genuine communist party, one whose mission is to cultivate and promote principled, effective leaders who can achieve genuine victories among the people. Xi Jinping began his career as a volunteer at the age of 16 in the countryside of Shaanxi, toiling alongside villagers and learning from revolutionary veterans and the common folk of the area. He then spent the 1980s working in some of the most poverty-stricken regions of China, before going on to lead 3 provinces, Fujian, Zhejiang, and Shanghai, which in total encompass 120 million people and an economy close to the size of India's. In each place where he served, he helped to develop effective approaches to economic uplift that fit the particular qualities of the region or community. And he always called upon the people to rely on their own strength, while also fostering cooperation between various provinces. And so when Western media declares that China is undemocratic, they ignore the fact that Xi, like every party official, has had to prove his qualities as a responsible, capable leader at every stage of government, with the ultimate litmus test being the high standards of the party and the trust of the people themselves. Forged by his grassroots experiences across a wide swath of society, from the rural countryside to major cities, Xi has emerged from the people and is thus vitally attuned to the people. This process of producing and testing leaders, which combines the broadest possible democratic base with China's long-running tradition of meritocracy, is scarcely imaginable in the West. When he became General Secretary of the CPC in 2012, China was at a crossroads.
India, the gift of Buddhism from India to China and how important that is. So I was wondering, especially because Jeremiah, you spent a lot of time studying Xi Jinping, if you got a sense of what the Communist Party of China today might see as the principal contradiction both in society but also in the world and what that means.
Did you say what the Communist Party of China would see as the principal contradiction? Just speak a little louder.
Oh yeah, the question is what you might think, what it seems like the Communist Party of China understands to be the principal contradiction of today for its own society or the world and what that would mean for, I don't know, the future.
I think in the way that there was one of the quotes I read where Xi Jinping quoted Sun Yat-sen and talked about like this tide of the world and how it's changing if you aren't actually keeping in touch or trying to understand that you're basically be like left behind by history. My sense is that even though like Xi Jinping is, even in his his public speeches, especially the international ones, he's very diplomatic. But at the same time, like my sense is that he's trying to show how this old world order of Western colonialism and domination is the old world order, and that like the principal contradictions between that old world order of Western domination and like war and neocolonialism and poverty, like that is contradicted with this like rising tide of peaceful coexistence, of cooperation between countries, of the development of peoples, like the ability for countries to develop on their own terms. And I don't know, that was the sense that I got at least from how like he talked in a lot of his speeches.
Can I just say something? If you don't mind, I think that's an important question because the language of principal contradiction, primary contradiction, secondary contradiction, antagonistic contradiction, non-antagonistic. See, I was brought up with all that. In a lot of ways, those formulations are not being used in at least the public discourse, and I would even suggest maybe in the private discourse about how to understand society and social development. In a lot of ways, that way of discussing contradiction, which you even found in the 1981 party's assessment of itself, I don't think it's used these days, and that language is most clearly developed in Mao Zedong's On Contradiction. I think the biggest question, as you pointed out last evening, is whether or not under socialism a class conflict emerges. And what the Communist Party and Deng Xiaoping and those ultimately concluded is that at a certain stage of socialist development, and not at the highest stage, the possibilities of a class conflict have a very small probability of occurring. Of course, realizing that anything is possible, you know, but the possibilities were very low in China. So Mao was talking about the class conflict as a conflict of ideas, you know. Now, that is a problem if one says she or he is a materialist. Because now there's a problem even the way I'm going to formulate this, that ideas emerge from material reality, that it's very difficult to sustain bourgeois ideas without a bourgeois class, or at least an emerging one. So at that point, I don't know, in the document it's not there, but at that point, in supporting a certain political movement, Mao had abandoned objective reality, I think, and I think had gone over to a fiction that there was a class conflict. Now, at the level of ideas, I hope I'm being clear enough here, but Xi Jinping, and here I agree with what Jeremiah is saying, speaks about world development. Where is the world going? And what are the contradictions driving the movement of humanity? And I think Jahan said that something we said a lot, the contradiction between humanity and war. That if the war danger is lifted from humanity, new possibilities of world development occurs. And I take the use of the word humanity as a signifier for the world. And thus, you know, you get this idea of new state forms, the state of the whole people. When the whole people, at least in places like China, I think in Cuba, I think in the People's Democratic Republic of Korea, a new level of consensus and unity of the people, which then shows that the whole idea that we are democracy and they are autocracies, for me goes down the drain, because there are no fundamental antagonistic conflicts in country, frankly, in Cuba. So that's why you don't know where did this come from. Some people say, well, it came from hip-hop lyrics, you know. But certainly you don't have those same conditions in China. But I'm of the opinion that increasingly, if you take out the war provocations that come essentially from the United States, if you remove that from human history, the logic of world development is qualitatively different. And thus, countries like India, they look very different, look very much like Purba was suggesting. Countries like South Korea look different, remove the US military bases. I would even suggest Japan, etc. Speak up.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I actually wrote this question early on in Doc's presentation. He mentioned world revolution.
in the context of what Mao was, his thoughts were setting up. And the question is, would you speak more on what world revolution is in the context of national sovereignty? Do they go hand in hand? Could they be contradictory?
Could they be contradictory?
Yeah. I don't know if that's even a good question.
It makes all the sense in the world. You're talking about world revolution. And I have to say, there is certain language and conceptualization that go back to the Russian Revolution, the rise of the Communist International and communist parties all over the world, and thus the vision of world revolutions or revolutions occurring in so many parts of the world simultaneously that it looks like a world revolution, that world imperialism would literally be overturned by a world revolution. And thus, no country that has a revolution could not remain revolutionary unless it exported its revolution to other countries. Looking back from today to there, I would say that so much of that is naive and unscientific. I think what we see, especially, and this is what Jeremiah is talking about, in studying Xi Jinping and the 18th Party Congress of 2012, which brought him to power, and it was not inevitable. That did not have to happen. I think that what he represents and the policies that he represents are not the same as Deng Xiaoping. Because, first of all, I think he represented the speeding up of the building of socialism, by which they meant, and he means, a greater control by the state of what is known as the commanding heights, the decisive levers of the economy. So you can have, everybody owns their own home, a lot of small businesses, bookstores, coffee shops, or whatever. They only account in quantitative terms for 50% of the economy, but nonetheless they are decisive, such as the biggest banks, the largest manufacturers, the high-tech corporations, and networks that engage all of those areas. If that is controlled by the state, one can say that our economy operates on socialist principles. Now, most people believe, well, if you have a socialist economy, well, how are people driving cars? Or why aren't they hungry? I mean, even leftists believe that if a certain standard of living is achieved, then you go on capitalist, without reference to the nature of economic relationships, the economic structure, and who controls the decisive levers of economic life. This is why, back in classical economics, they called it political economy. And in many ways, socialist economics is a further development of political economy as a science and a discipline. So I guess I'm saying all of that to say that the concept of, quote, world revolution was of a different period and I think carried a lot of naivete. However, the idea of a world unity against war and imperialism is as good as saying we're going to have a world revolution. You know, I don't know whether that makes sense. If we are able to establish unity against war and imperialism, I guess we could throw into that white supremacy and anti-communism, because that comes with the package. The only justification for war today is anti-communism and racism. There's no real other. So, a united front, a world unity, on those terms, is a high development of politics and consciousness, and requires, as we know from our work in the Free School, just putting this together, requires sophisticated ideological and political work among people. And that is where people are, where the basic sections of people are. So we're talking about the unions, the churches, the community organizations, the anti-gentrification movement, and students, but students cannot impose on the people their ideas and their interests. That's where I don't know what I'm answering adequately here.
I just wanted to quickly add to what Doug was saying, but I think, yeah, it's like even the term world revolution conjures up a lot of mental images of like people with guns and stuff, but I think that's also why, I think a lot of people have touched on this today, but something like the Bandung Conference. Yeah, that's why the Bandung Conference is so important, I think, because it's, in my view, it is advancing this kind of world revolutionary force, or as Doc put it, this world unity against imperialism. But it doesn't look like this whole, the way that I think we in America or leftists are taught to think, it's like everyone is just like literally going and marching. Like all of these countries are going to go march on America or something. But it's more this broad united front that they were able to build of people who are united in principle on, especially this principle of peace. This principle of finding commonalities and working together, and then also the non-aligned movement as like a further attempt to build upon that, and for basically like the majority of humanity to be united for peace and against imperialism and imperialist wars. And I think that is the kind of future struggle around the world that I think has to be waged, and not I think the kind of concepts that we've sort of been taught to believe, like, oh, this is what revolution means like around the world.
And to me, you know, going back to Purba's thing of 600 million youth, which I think is a lot bigger, but let's just say in Asia, let's say 1 billion young people, and then of course, let's say Europe and North America. The great cause of the younger generation is the fight for peace. And then for climate change, but for peace. Because with peace and with peaceful coexistence, humanity can begin to solve its greatest existential problems. But you can't say, I'm for solving the climate problem, but I want to have war in the Taiwan Straits. Because you're not going to solve the climate problem without the People's Republic of China. It is probably the indispensable nation to solving climate, and pandemics. But peace, imperialism, and I guess I'll say it like this. The existence of imperialism is the greatest threat to humanity. And I think, and forgive me if I'm a little off on this, that the great anxiety and emergency and all this stuff about climate change, which does exist, often is used as a narrative to obscure that the greatest threat to humanity is the existence of imperialism and the 800 US military bases, and war and nuclear war. And of course, a president like the one we have in there now, who is talking about if you don't stop hacking into our corporations and elections, it could get into a hot war. So, well, yeah, that's, let me show you.
Okay, if there are no further questions, we'll thank the panelists once again for their wonderful presentations and the discussion.